John leaned against the kitchen counter, his fingers wrapped tightly around the edge. His heart was pounding harder than he wanted to admit, his pulse racing for reasons he was only now beginning to understand. Across the room, Andy, his best friend's brother, stood talking to a group of friends. His laughter echoed through the space, carefree and infectious. John's gaze lingered on Andy's smile, the way his lips curled, and how his eyes lit up when he was genuinely amused. It wasn't the first time John had caught himself staring. In fact, it was happening more often than not. But now, with the house full of people, the situation felt more intense, more intimate, like the world had shrunk to just the two of them, despite the chaos around them. Andy glanced over, catching John's eye for just a second before he flashed that easy smile, the one that always made John's stomach twist. It was a dangerous smile, one that felt like it saw right through him, peeling back the layers of friendship and exposing something deeper, something forbidden. John quickly looked away, heat creeping up his neck. What was he doing? This was Andy, his best friend's younger brother. And yet, every time they were in the same room, John felt the unspoken tension growing between them, pulling them closer, even when they tried to keep their distance. Later that evening, after most of the guests had left, the house quieted down. John was cleaning up the remnants of the party, trying to keep his hands busy, to distract himself from the thoughts swirling in his head. The kitchen door swung open, and Andy stepped in, his shirt unbuttoned halfway down his chest, a lazy grin on his face. "You look like you're thinking too much," Andy teased, his voice low and smooth. John's heart skipped a beat. He forced a laugh, but it came out too soft, too unsure. "Just cleaning up. What about you? You still hanging around?" Andy shrugged, stepping closer. "Figured I'd help you out. Besides, it's quieter now. Easier to talk." John froze for a moment, not sure how to respond. He could feel Andy's eyes on him, studying his every move, every nervous gesture. It was like the air had changed, thickened with something unspoken. John turned around to face him, and the way Andy looked at him made everything shift. The space between them seemed to shrink in an instant, and John could feel the pull. An electric current running between them, tugging at the edges of restraint. Andy took another step forward, his hand brushing against John's as he reached for a glass on the counter. It was a simple, innocent touch, but it set fire to John's skin. He inhaled sharply, the tension in the room suddenly palpable. "I've seen the way you look at me, John," Andy whispered, his voice barely audible but heavy with meaning. John's breath caught in his throat. He wanted to deny it, to laugh it off like a joke, but he couldn't. Not when Andy was standing so close, his eyes dark with something John didn't want to name yet, something he'd been trying to ignore for months. "What are you talking about?" John muttered, though the words felt hollow. Andy stepped even closer, his breath warm against John's cheek. "Don't play dumb. You feel it too." There it was, laid out between them, the truth neither of them had dared to speak. John's hands trembled as he stood there, inches away from Andy, their bodies so close now he could feel the heat radiating from him. He should step back, should push Andy away, but instead, his hand moved on its own, reaching up to cup the side of Andy's face. His thumb brushed across Andy's jaw, and for a second, the world stood still. Andy didn't flinch. He didn't pull away. Instead, he leaned into the touch, his eyes closing for a brief moment before he opened them again, and the intensity there made John's knees weak. When they finally pulled apart, both of them were breathing heavily, their foreheads pressed together. John's heart was racing, his thoughts a mess, but in that moment, nothing else mattered except the way Andy was looking at him. "Tell me you don't want this," Andy whispered, his voice rough with desire. John closed his eyes, his hands still resting against Andy's chest. He couldn't lie. Because as wrong as it felt, It also felt inevitable, like he'd been waiting for this moment, even if he hadn't realized it. "I can't," John finally whispered. Andy's hand slipped down John's arm, fingers brushing against his skin in a way that sent shivers down his spine. "Then don't fight it." John's resolve crumbled in that instant. There was no going back now, no pretending this wasn't happening. But just as things were about to spiral out of control, a sudden knock at the door snapped them both back to reality. John pulled away, breathless, his heart still racing. Andy looked equally shaken, his eyes wide with the same mixture of shock and desire that John felt. "Shit," John muttered, running a hand through his hair as he tried to steady his breathing. The knock at the door reverberated in the silence that had engulfed them, pulling both John and Andy back into the harsh light of reality. John's chest heaved with every breath, his mind struggling to process what had just happened. Andy stood frozen, eyes still locked on him, lips slightly parted as if they too were unsure whether to form words or simply follow through on the desire still thick in the air. John swallowed hard, taking a step back. "That's probably your brother," he whispered, his voice strained, almost afraid to break the fragile moment they just shared. Andy glanced toward the door, his jaw tightening for a second before he forced a nod. "Yeah, I guess." The door cracked open, and sure enough, Luke, John's best friend and Andy's older brother, stepped inside, completely oblivious to the tension crackling in the air. He smiled at them both, not noticing the lingering heat between them. "Hey, you guys done cleaning up? I'm heading out. Figured you might want to crash soon too," Luke said casually, his gaze flicking between the two, but thankfully not staying long enough to notice the red flush still on John's face. John nodded quickly, stepping further away from Andy. "Yeah, we're about done here." Luke smiled, gave a quick nod, and headed out the door, leaving them alone once again. The silence was deafening, and when the door finally closed, John let out a shaky breath, his eyes refusing to meet Andy's. "I should go," John muttered, wiping his hands on his jeans, as if that would somehow erase the feeling of Andy's touch still burning into his skin. Andy's voice was low, almost pleading. "John, wait." John froze, but didn't turn around. He didn't trust himself if he looked at Andy again, not with the way his body was still humming with the memory of their kiss. "I don't know what this is," John finally said, his voice strained, "but it can't happen again." There was a beat of silence, followed by the soft shuffle of Andy's footsteps coming closer. "Why not?" Andy's voice was softer now, filled with an ache John wasn't prepared to hear. "You feel this too." "I know you do." John clenched his fists, his mind racing. How could he explain that this wasn't just about feelings, that there were real consequences to whatever had started between them? Luke would never understand. John didn't even understand. But he knew one thing. Getting involved with his best friend's brother was a line he wasn't ready to cross. Andy's hand reached out, gently brushing John's arm, and it sent a fresh wave of electricity through his body. "Don't walk away from this, John." "Not yet." John finally turned around, and the look in Andy's eyes was enough to undo him all over again. It was raw and vulnerable, so unlike the cocky smile Andy usually wore. It made John's heart twist painfully in his chest. "Do you even understand what you're asking?" John asked, his voice a mixture of frustration and longing. "Luke is your brother. He's my best friend. This would mess everything up." Andy's jaw clenched, but he didn't back down. "You think I don't know that? You think I haven't thought about what this could do? But I don't care anymore, John. I can't keep pretending like I don't feel this way." The sincerity in Andy's voice struck John like a punch to the gut. He looked away, trying to find the words to explain, to push Andy away before it was too late, but nothing came. Because deep down, he didn't want to push Andy away. He wanted him, badly. Andy's hand cupped John's face, tilting it upward so their eyes met again. You don't have to say anything. Just don't run from this. Don't run from me. John's chest heaved as he looked into Andy's eyes, searching for something. Anything that would make this easier. But all he found was that same pull, that same magnetic force that had been drawing them together for months. Before he could think, before he could stop himself, John surged forward, his lips crashing into Andy's once more. This time there was no hesitation, no second guessing. But even in the heat of the moment, the weight of reality pressed down on John. He pulled back slightly, his forehead resting against Andy's, both of them panting, their bodies still pressed together. "What are we doing?" John whispered, his voice hoarse. Andy's hand slid up to cradle the back of John's head, his fingers tangling in his hair. "Something we should have done a long time ago." He breathed out, his lips brushing against John's with each word. John wanted to believe that. He wanted to lose himself in Andy, to forget about everything else and just give in to what they both so clearly wanted. But a small voice in the back of his mind whispered warnings. About Luke, about the fallout, about the lines they were about to cross. But when Andy kissed him again, all those thoughts faded into the background. Every nerve in his body was alive, and yet, deep down, the weight of what was happening began to press in on him. He loved this. He wanted Andy, more than he had ever wanted anyone. But as his fingers tangled in Andy's hair, pulling him closer, his mind raced with the inevitable consequences. Luke, his best friend, was Andy's brother. This wasn't just some fleeting moment. If they crossed this line, everything would change. "Andy," John breathed, his voice trembling with both desire and hesitation. Andy pulled back slightly, his eyes dark with emotion as he searched John's face. "What's wrong?" John swallowed hard, his fingers still gripping Andy's shirt as if letting go would break whatever fragile connection they had just forged. "It's not that I don't want this. I do. But, Luke." Andy's expression softened, and he sighed, stepping back just a little, though his hands still rested on John's hips. "I know, John. I know what you're thinking. But, do you really think I care about what Luke thinks right now? This is between us." John's chest tightened. "But it's not that simple." "Why not?" Andy's eyes were intense, searching his for answers. "What are we so afraid of?" John shook his head, running a hand through his hair. "I don't know. Losing everything, I guess. What if he hates us? What if it ruins everything?" Andy's hands tightened around John's waist, pulling him close again. "I can't lose you, John. Not after everything we've been through. I'll talk to Luke, okay? I'll make him understand. But I need you to meet me halfway." John's heart pounded in his chest. Every part of him screamed to give in, to let go of the fear and just be with Andy. And yet, the thought of Luke, his best friend, finding out, the potential fallout weighed heavily on him. But when he looked into Andy's eyes, all that fear melted away. What they had, whatever this was worth fighting for. He couldn't walk away now, not when they had come this far. "I'm in," John finally whispered, his voice filled with resolve. "But we do this together. No secrets." A slow, relieved smile spread across Andy's face, his hand coming up to cup John's cheek. Together. The kiss that followed was different this time. Gentler, more deliberate, but just as intense. It wasn't rushed or frantic, but a promise. A promise that whatever came next, they'd face it together. As they stood there, wrapped in each other's arms, the weight of the moment settled around them. They had crossed a line, one that couldn't be uncrossed. But for the first time in a long time, John didn't feel conflicted. He didn't feel scared. Instead, he felt hopeful. Because, despite everything, despite the risks and the uncertainty, what he had with Andy felt right. It felt real. And as they stood there, tangled in each other's embrace, John knew they'd figure it out. Together. But as the euphoria of the moment began to fade, reality crept back in. Andy's phone buzzed in his pocket, breaking the quiet between them. He pulled it out, glancing at the screen, and his face paled slightly. "What is it?" John asked, concern lacing his voice. "It's Luke," Andy murmured. "He's on his way back." John's heart stopped for a second. He had just made peace with what was happening between them, but now the thought of facing Luke sent a jolt of anxiety through him. "What are we going to do?" Andy took a deep breath, his eyes meeting John's with a quiet determination. "We tell him the truth." John nodded slowly, his stomach churning with nerves. This was it. There was no turning back now. And as Andy reached out, intertwining his fingers with John's, he knew that whatever happened next, they were in this together. And somehow, that made the uncertainty of what was to come just a little bit easier to bear. Sound of the front door opening echoed down the hallway. John's heart pounded in his chest as Luke's footsteps grew louder, closer. He glanced at Andy, who gave his hand a reassuring squeeze. They had crossed the line, but they were ready to face whatever came next. Together.